Elder Moore.
Turn to Ezekiel, the 8th chapter, where we ended last night, in Revelation 7. If you can hold both of those open, it will be helpful. It's good this evening to be able to open the Bible again and to share together in the message of God for this hour. We've considered the fact that the 40 years of wilderness wandering were a divinely ordained type of the future experience of God's people as they move from the Egypt of sin to the heavenly Canaan. Unfortunately, because the people of Israel did not enter into the rest that God had for them, the lessons of the type are in the negative rather than positive. You read 1 Corinthians 10 and verses 1 through 11, where it discusses the parallel between ancient Israel and the time just before Christ comes. You'll find that the parallels are all in the negative. And it warns us against the failure of the people of God at that time. You'll recall that as a result of their failure at the Jordan, when the 12 spies went into the land of Canaan, they returned with fruit, but a bad report. 2 of those spies, Caleb and Joshua, brought a good report. And they said, we are able to go up. The others said, we are not able. We cannot go up. Why, those walled cities, everything about it is formidable. Giants, huge men. How can we go up? We have no armor. We have no weapons. We have nothing. And there are just a handful of us. There are many of them. They've got iron chariots. Oh, there's so many things in their favor. We cannot go up. There is no way. Brothers and sisters, do you know that for nearly a century we've been echoing the report of the 10 spies? We cannot go up, we say. Oh yes, we expect God to take us up eventually, but we have not had the courage or the faith to believe that God will take us across the Jordan and into the land of Canaan in the way He has marked out. We have felt that somehow the script has to be revised. Certainly it is impossible for us to have the experience that is outlined in the Bible and the Spirit of prophecy, in which there is to be a great finale, a great climax in the conflict between good and evil, such that will deny Satan's claims fully and reveal the glory of God. We are not able, the 10 spies said. Caleb and Joshua earnestly affirmed, we are able. Because the people accepted the report of the 10 rather than the 2, they weren't able. Indeed, we are not able today to enter into the fulfillment of God's promises. We are not able, so long as we listen to the report of the spies who have sized things up, and as they evaluate, have discovered that there really is no human way. Indeed, there is no human way. The 10 spies were right. Caleb and Joshua were wrong. The 10 spies were absolutely right. And if we had been there on that day, we probably would have recognized that they were right. They had the evidence. They were able to report on the various specific cities and to describe their walls and to describe their ammunitions and to describe all of the various things they had, and they were right. these things did exist. They were right. That was much more than enough to overwhelm a small group of people that are just emerging from the wilderness. They were right. Certainly they were correct in their assessment of the relative superiority of the forces that lay across the Jordan. But they made one fatal mistake. And that was they failed to recognize that with God, all things are possible. And that it matters not with God whether there are many or few. It doesn't really make any difference whether there are weapons or not. Indeed, God later gave evidence of the fact that the Israelites didn't really have to fight at all, because God had in his armory various kinds of weapons. You'll remember that at one time hailstones wiped out an army. He had many weapons that he could call on, which might have made it unnecessary for the people to even fight at all. Indeed, had they had sufficient faith, they may never have had to have fought a single battle. But brothers and sisters, we're faced today with the same decision. Same decision. We must make our decision not on the basis of the evidence. I could spend the whole evening summarizing with you the evidence of my experience, the evidence of the experience of some of you that I know. Others I don't know, but I could still give your experience. I may not know the details, but I could surely explain some of your failures. Even if I didn't know that that belonged to you in particular, I could enumerate some, and I would catch some of your failures and your weaknesses after having, for many years, been asking God for victory. Now, there's plenty of evidence. Indeed, there is no way for us. There is absolutely no way for the promises of God to be fulfilled in our strength. Indeed, they will not be fulfilled until we come to the point where our faith is such that we recognize, first of all, that we are totally incapable of going up. And secondly, that he says go up, and when we are prepared to rest upon the naked word of God and claim his strength and his power and claim his direction for the revelation of his glory, until we are able to do that, brothers and sisters, we can't go up. Indeed, the reason why we are still here is that God in his mercy did the same thing for us that he did for the people of Israel. When they had cried all night, they were ready to stone Caleb and Joshua for even reporting that they could go up. Why, these men it was just impossible for the 10 and the rest of the people to put up with the nonsense of the two, who in the face of all of the odds were willing to say, we can go up. They were ready to stone them. They were ready to appoint themselves a leader. Stone Moses with them. Appoint themselves a leader and march back to Egypt during the night. And then God entered in, rescued his servants from their destructive acts, and declared that what they had predicted would certainly take place, that they would die in the wilderness. Not their children, as they predicted, but themselves. You will die in the wilderness. Your children will go in. By this time, their feelings had reversed. And suddenly, when they realized that 40 long years lie ahead of them, each day of spying resulting in 1 year of wandering. When they discovered this, they said, no, we're not going to stay in the wilderness. We're going up. We can do it. Oh, wait a minute. They couldn't do it. Could they? They were right the first time. under the system they chose, the system of human reason and human power, they were right the first time. But when God now said, you're going to stay in the wilderness, you'll die, and your bones will bleach on the desert sands. Now they said, oh, if we're going to die in the wilderness, we might as well die fighting. Let's go up. Maybe we can do it. We can do it. Surely we can. Let's do it. And so they whipped up their psychology, their own emotions, and the first thing you know, they had an army ready to go out, and Moses pled with them. He said, don't you go up. The Lord is not with you. Oh, but they said, we're going up. How amazing it is that those who are in rebellion against God are able, when it suits their cause, to believe that they can do the impossible, and yet not willing to trust that God will give them the victories that are impossible. And so they marched, but they didn't march home. They ran home. Not everyone came back. And their bones did bleach on the desert sand. And they did not enter into rest. In the days of David, God gave another chance, as we found in Psalm 95, verses 7 through 11. Today, after so long a time, enter into his rest. I want you to have rest and freedom from the Egypt of sin. I want to give you the victory. I want to give you the new covenant experience. But again, the philosophy of the 10 spies won out. And the tribes of Israel failed to enter into his rest. Centuries later, God spoke to a man by the name of Ezekiel and said, you lay on your right side 40 days. Each day for a what? For a year. Now notice how the principle works. A day for a year. It really doesn't matter too much whether we're moving from the day to a year or a year to a day. It's still a day to a year, isn't it? Some people suggest that because Ezekiel 4:6 is translating from years back to days, that the principle doesn't reveal anything about a day-to-year principle. But brothers and sisters, it is exactly the same principle of number 1434, in which the spies' days are translated into years in the wilderness. Now, for the sake of the convenience of an illustration, which would be too long to wait 40 years for it to be carried out, God says, I use the same principle. This time I'm going to take the years and translate them into days. But the important thing is that this was the time in which God was giving them another chance. This whole period of time in which the prophecies of Jeremiah and Ezekiel were given, these prophecies opened to the people another chance for rest. This time, rest from the Babylonian captivity, which they were just then entering into. The same captivity, in spiritual terms, as the Egyptian captivity. And the return from a Babylonian captivity, again God offered them that rest. But the Bible shows they did not receive the rest. And in the days of the apostle to the Hebrews, again we hear the plea. Today, after so long a time. And then he reminds us of David in chapter 4, verse 7. He says, David called the people to rest after a long time. They didn't do it. Now it remains for us. Are we willing to enter into the rest? But brothers and sisters, the impossible did not take place then, because the philosophy of the 10 spies still prevailed, at least for the great majority. And so their bones bleached in the great desert of sin, which is described in the Bible, particularly in the wilderness experience, which Daniel and Revelation portray as lasting a period of 1260 what? 60 days. But you said years. How do you see, brothers and sisters, The wilderness experience of the 1260 years is another period of wilderness wandering which is parallel to the 40. And the 40 years, God used the day-for-year principle. And it's natural for him to use the day-for-year principle when it comes to the 1260 years of wandering in the wilderness. What is so interesting to my mind is that the day-year principle was returned to Israel in force by Ezekiel in two different sessions of lying on his side, his left side for 390 days, each day for a year, and 40 days, each day for a year, just at the very time God was preparing to give those great prophecies to Daniel, which would project to the very end of time. It's an interesting thing how God confirms his word in very interesting ways. Ezekiel and Daniel were contemporaries. Ezekiel wrote first. Ezekiel marked out God's purpose for honoring the year-day principle, and Daniel applied it to two different major prophecies leading from the period of time, the general period of time in which he was living, in one case, clear down to the end of time, and the other, some distance this side of Christ, almost that far. Well, God has a wonderful plan. And my security rests not only in his assurance, I know the thoughts that I think toward you. Thoughts of peace and not of evil. His assurance that all the trials and tribulations that I enter into, and even his judgment of me and his judgments in my behalf, are all intended to purify. This is encouraging. But brothers and sisters, in our day and age, it's also encouraging to know that we have not followed cunningly devised fables, and that there is strong evidence in Scripture for the year-day principle, and that God himself designed that the challenge of this hour be met in numerous ways, including the fact that God placed Ezekiel there to call attention to the year-day principle in unequivocal terms, so that we who live today might be able to see that these two prophets living at the same time were operating under the same principle. Now this evening we're going to do something which I trust will be encouraging and interesting to you. And I've asked my sister Miriam, who's been teaching in the nursing school here at Angwin since her return from Africa, I think it was 1965. I've asked her to help me by putting some things on the board. We're going to have 3 columns. The first column will be Daniel 7 and 8. The second column, Daniel 10 and 12. The third column, Revelation 10 and 11. Now, while she sets this up, I'll just comment that there are going to be 2 different times in which I'm going to throw in something from Ezekiel on that first column. She'll use a different color, so it'll be evident that that one is from Ezekiel. She'll also write Ezekiel in there. But while she's doing this, I want to call attention to the chapter 8 and 9 of Ezekiel, which will not be on the board, but I want them to be in your mind, and they will form the setting for these 3 columns. And so let us look back to Ezekiel, the 8th chapter, and we will note there that Ezekiel is experiencing what he calls the visions of what? The visions of God. And in the visions of God, he sees God as a flaming fire, and he sees those cherubim, and he sees the wheels within the wheels. It is a very impressive sight. Indeed, he sees the throne of God itself. And then God takes Ezekiel on a trip. God chooses to conduct an investigative judgment in his sanctuary. And he chooses to take Ezekiel with him. We won't dwell much on this, but I think it's of significance that the investigative judgment that God conducted was for the sake of Ezekiel and the people of Israel. Not for his own sake, that he could discover what he didn't know, but so that he could reveal to Ezekiel and through Ezekiel to the people of Israel what he knew. And so we begin an investigative judgment, and it's very interesting. It says, he put forth the form of a hand, in verse 3, and took me by the lock of mine head. And the Spirit lifted me up between the earth and heaven and brought me in the visions of God. What was it he was brought in? The visions of what? Remember that, brothers and sisters. Ezekiel is dealing not with just some visions of some airplanes or something of that kind, as we learned the other day, but visions of what? Of God. All right, in the visions of God. And he took me and he showed me the door of the inner gate toward the what? The north. Tomorrow night we're going to deal with the question of the north again. Where was the seat of the image of jealousy? The seat represents a throne. Now in Ezekiel, God repeatedly shows Ezekiel his throne. And now we find in his sanctuary something that he is very jealous about. A seat of jealousy. A seat of the image of jealousy. Someone else has aspired to take his place within his sanctuary. No wonder God is going to do a work of judgment, because there are some very serious problems developing within his own sanctuary. And then later on he keeps saying, I'm going to show you, Ezekiel, greater abominations than this. Now, note that God knows in each case, before he gets to the next step, what he's going to find, doesn't he? And he announces it ahead of time. He says, Son of man, I'm going to show you greater abominations than these, verse 6. That the house of Israel committeth here, that I should go far off from my what? From my sanctuary. Indeed, it is so bad, he says, that it's just about to force me to leave and go far off. And he did go far off, and the sanctuary was destroyed as a result. He says, again, in that same verse, you see greater abominations. Over and over again in that chapter, he says that. And then when we get through, after having noted that the people are worshiping Tammuz, which is a symbol of Nimrod, the builder of the Tower of Babel, and is a symbol of Babylon worship. And then he finds the people worshiping the sun, and with their backs to the sanctuary, discrediting the very purpose of the sanctuary, and doing that which God said never do. Don't you worship the sun. After all of these things, then verse 18 of the chapter 8 says, Therefore I also will deal in fury. Mine eyes shall not spare, neither will I have pity, and though they cry in mine ears with a loud voice, yet will I not hear them. Now this sounds like a very harsh statement, but I would remind you that in Ezekiel itself, God pleads with them a number of times. He says, turn ye, why will you die, house of Israel? I have no pleasure in the death of the wicked. Which means that his decision is based upon their requirement. Their refusal to listen to him forces him not to listen to them. There is no basis upon which he can listen to them if they are not willing to look to his substitute and his designed method and plan of saving them, Jesus Christ himself. And then chapter 9 says, He cried also in mine ears with a loud voice, saying, Cause them that have charge over the city to draw near. What city is it? The city of Babylon? What city is it? Oh, it's the city of Jerusalem. I want you to notice that the investigative judgment, brothers and sisters, in Ezekiel's day was not an investigation of the sins of Babylon. It was an investigation of the sins of whom? Of the Jewish people. According to Scripture, and the great and wonderful gift that God has given us for these last days, the investigative judgment in the last days is not an investigation of the sins of the non-professors, but of those who claim to believe. So it's in Jerusalem. And then it says, the 6 men came from the way of the higher gate which lieth toward the north, and every man a slaughter weapon in his hand, and one man among them was clothed with what? Listen, I want you to listen to that. He was clothed with what? Linen. And a writer's inkhorn was in his hand. And what was he doing with that inkhorn? What was he doing? Oh, putting a mark where? In the foreheads. What does the forehead symbolize? God over and over again told Ezekiel that he was a type. And by the way, we have no hesitancy to use Ezekiel as a type for several reasons. Number one, it's locked in a number of ways. And secondly, God repeatedly told Ezekiel that he himself was a type. And even what he was doing, you remember, he was to set up some battering rams and so forth. Everything he did was a type. All right? And we're going to discover tonight, we've already discovered last night, many parallels between the type in Ezekiel and Revelation. We're going to find out tonight there's a tremendous parallel between Ezekiel, Daniel, and Revelation. So the writer's inkhorn, and he was to place a mark on the foreheads of those that do what? That sigh and that criticize the way the brethren do things. Is that what it says? That sigh and cry. Brothers and sisters, criticism is a very shallow thing. It's superficial. It doesn't touch the real problem. But those who sigh and cry give evidence of the recognition of the real nature of sin, and recognize that they themselves have dishonored God. And when they see the abominations in the city of Jerusalem and in the church, they're led to recognize that those very things that they see in the church are but a reflection of their own disposition. And not only does the church defile the name of God, but as individuals, that name is defiled. Only when we learn to sigh and cry with a deep, earnest mourning over our own sins, as well as the sins within the church, which exist because we are in the church, only then will we be able to receive the mark, the seal in the forehead. You see, in order for that seal to be in the forehead, what does the forehead represent again? The mind. What is it that is sealed in the forehead? According to Revelation, we go to chapter 7 of Revelation, it gives the same picture. And it says that there is something printed in the foreheads. And it shows how many that receive it. 144,000. Again, it's in the forehead. You go to chapter 14, verse 1, and it states very clearly what is printed in the forehead. What is it? What is it? The Father's name written in the forehead. What does a name stand for? Character. The very character of the Christ imprinted in the mind. Why? Because of hatred for sin. Brothers and sisters, we cannot love sin and righteousness at the same time. Only to the degree we learn to hate sin and mourn over its existence, whether in ourselves or in others, and if in others, recognizing that that is basically the way we operate except by the grace of God. Only when we learn to abhor sin will the character of God be restored to mankind and placed in our foreheads. As a man thinketh in his heart, so is he. You may not be what you think you are, but what you think, you are. When the seal of God is placed upon the forehead, the life will reveal it. Now, brothers and sisters, this is the background for our study tonight. We've talked about the man clothed in what? Linen. What does he do? He puts a mark. Where? In the foreheads. What is his mark? The Father's name. He places it upon whom? All who sigh and cry for the abominations done in Babylon. Oh, yes. Somebody says Israel? Oh, yes. But their sighing and crying is over the sins in Jerusalem, not in Babylon. Brothers and sisters, it's enough for us to be sad about what happens in Babylon. But Babylon does not claim to represent the true God as Jerusalem does. It is the sins of Jerusalem that profane God's sanctuary. Now, we'll find out tomorrow night that involves Babylon too, because many who are professed citizens of Jerusalem are actually citizens of what? Of Babylon. So there is an involvement there. But the tragedy, brothers and sisters, is not what the world does. Terrible as it is, the crimes we've had in the small city where I live in Farmington, there have been several murders just recently. A lady who was, for years, the one who handled the money order. What is it? What do you call it when you send money to somebody? No, not a money order. That's in the post office. What? Yeah, Western Union. Yeah, she had Western Union for years. And just the other day, she stepped out of her little curio shop where she handled the Western Union thing. And when she came back, there was a man in her shop who came out and shot her and killed her. But that same week, there were 2 or 3 murders right there in that same town. All kinds of things that are happening all over. But brothers and sisters, as terrible as this is, that is not the subject, the real subject that should call forth our sighing and crying. Surely we shouldn't be happy about that. But that is outside. But the tragedy is what comes inside. That church, particularly that church called by God to represent the character of Christ. Upon that body of people who claim to have the judgment hour message, indeed have been commissioned with it. But that judgment hour message, brothers and sisters, is a message which is designed to reveal the character of God. I am grateful that God foresaw the problems that would exist. They did not catch him off guard. And though we must sigh and cry, we do not need to lose our confidence. Even the very condition that causes us to sigh and cry has been spelled out clearly by the great God of heaven. Now, my sister's getting a little anxious to do some more writing. She's gone as far as she can until we move on here. So we're going to move on now. We're going to go to Daniel, the 10th chapter, and the 5th and 6th verses. And I hope you have your Bibles. If you don't, you're going to miss a significant part of the impact of this study. Daniel, the 10th chapter, and verses 5 and 6. Then I lifted up mine eyes and looked, and behold, a certain man clothed in what? Clothed what? In linen, whose loins were girded with fine gold of Uphaz. His body also was like the beryl, and his face as the appearance of lightning, and his eyes as lamps of fire, and his arms and his feet like a color of polished brass, and the voice of his words like the voice of a multitude. Do you know there are several different words in here that actually come directly from Ezekiel. Now remember that Daniel had the book of Ezekiel, undoubtedly had read it through many times. And there's no question but what Daniel chose from the book of Ezekiel. Symbols that would make it possible for him to relate the great vision for God. Indeed, I say Daniel chose. I'm talking about his expression of it. The vision that Daniel was given called for it, but Daniel's very expressions, in many cases, are an echo directly from Ezekiel. A man clothed in what? Linen. The beryl. The fire. There are a number of things. You go back to Ezekiel and you compare these and you find out that there's significant parallel. And notice the fire there, which has been a very central element in the book of Ezekiel right from the very first chapter. Well, so we find this, and then chapter 10 of Revelation. We're going to have to move back and forth here a bit. But chapter 10 of Revelation. And we're going to read from verse 1. And I saw another angel come down from heaven, clothed with a cloud, and a rainbow was upon his head, and his face was as it were the sun, and his feet as pillars of what? Fire. Do you see the comparison between the man clothed in linen in Ezekiel, the man clothed in linen in Daniel, and this angel in Revelation? Well, let's go back for a moment to Ezekiel and note one further thing, and then we're going to give thought to Daniel again. But in Ezekiel, in chapter 10, we find a specific description of the throne. Chapter 10, verse 1. Then I looked, and behold, in the firmament that was above the head of the cherubims, there appeared over them as it were a sapphire stone, as the appearance of the likeness of a what? A throne. And he spake unto the man clothed with linen. Do you see it? All right, now we have the throne right here, and it is described in terms of its brilliance. And then he spake to the man clothed with linen and said, go in between the wheels. You remember those were introduced in chapter 1. And those wheels represent the intricate providence of God and the government of God, as the throne indicates, in carrying out the great purposes of God, even though it looks like things are just all going awry. Between the wheels, even under the what? The cherub. And fill thine hand with coals of what? Fire. Do you see how central fire is to the judgment scene of Ezekiel? It is also central to the judgment scene in Revelation. We won't have time to establish that tonight, but you can easily do that for yourself. Scatter them over the city. And then verse 4 says, then the glory of the Lord went up from the cherub, and stood over the threshold of the house, and the house was filled with a cloud, and the court was full of the brightness of the Lord. And then it speaks about the voice of God Almighty when he speaketh. Now remember, that's what it says over here about the voice of God Almighty. The parallels are so tremendous. They're demanding that we ask, why are these parallels so many? I want you to know, brothers and sisters, the message which God gave to us well over a century ago is stronger and more firm, not weaker than we thought. And God is calling for us to study our Bibles. There are many, many ways of establishing truth, and God has specifically chosen to place many, many paths to an understanding of His truth, so that in times of confusion and difficulty, there would be something that would help the various kinds of minds, and together these would tend to confirm the truth as nothing else could. The voice of God Almighty. The glory of the Lord. What is the purpose of this vision? To reveal the glory of the Lord. What is the glory of the Lord? It is the character of the Lord. All right, what is the sealing intended to do in chapter 8 then? You put a mark upon the foreheads of them that sigh and that cry. We get to Revelation and we find drawn directly from Ezekiel the picture of the sealing in the foreheads, and we're told that it is a sealing of the Father's name or character, which is the glory of God. Now, brothers and sisters, the tragic thing is that God, in the investigative judgment with Israel, had to slay the great majority because they did not look and live. He says, turn ye, for why will you die? You don't have to die. Jeremiah pled with the people. He said, you don't even have to go into Babylon. If you'll just surrender to the king of Babylon, because he is your king now, you've chosen him. Even if you turn back to God, you still must learn what it means to serve under the God you already chose. You can be faithful to God, but you must realize that as you sow, so shall you also reap. And when they failed, then finally he says, all right, too late now for you to stay in Jerusalem. No way. You surrender and go into Babylon. But no, they wouldn't do it. The vast majority of God's people were destroyed in the investigative judgment scene. That is the scene in which God judged his people and gave a picture to Jeremiah and a picture to Ezekiel so that they could portray it before the people and help them to examine their own hearts and for them to understand the defilement of the sanctuary and the need for its cleansing by a restoration of the character of God in their lives. Well, the glory. I guess we need to get on to the next one, chapter 8, probably chapter 12 of Daniel. Not until it comes. It doesn't matter. Chapter 12, verses 5 and 6. This is a passage we haven't looked at yet, but you'll think we have when we read it. Verses 5 and 6. Then I, Daniel, looked, and behold, there stood other two, the one on this side of the bank of the river, and the other on the other side of the bank of the river. And one said to the man clothed in what? The man clothed in linen, which was upon the waters of the river. All right. Now, where is this man clothed with linen? We have two different observers and two different individuals who are going to be speaking to him, one on one side of the river, the other on the other side, and who are they looking to and who are they addressing? They're speaking to the man clothed with the linen, and where is he? Upon the waters. What do waters represent? People. That's right. Revelation 17:15. Who is it that is closest to the people and so close that he is seen as being upon the waters? It is Christ himself. The man clothed with linen, the description as given in Daniel 10, which we read a while ago, could be none other than a divine being, because it describes him in a manner to reveal divine presence, the fire of God. And so, they're speaking to the man who is upon the river. Well, this is of interest because in Daniel, the 8th chapter, we have in verse 14, in answer to the question, how long will certain things be, the answer is, unto 2,300 days, then shall what? The sanctuary be cleansed. Now, this is as a result of the question of one saint to another. Now, I want you to notice in chapter 12, we find two saints, one on one side of the river, one on the other side, and they are addressing a third being who is upon the waters. And now in chapter 8, we find Two saints, one speaking to the other, and one asking, how long is it going to be? I want you to notice, brothers and sisters, that God has a lot of interesting ways of helping us to know that he is picking up the same theme, and that he wants us to go back to the previous theme. By parallels of various kinds, God tells us what he wants us to learn from this. All right? Now, here are two beings. One is asking a question of the other, and an answer comes. Unto 2,300 days, and then what? Shall the sanctuary be cleansed? And it came to pass, when even I, Daniel, had seen what? The vision. Now I want you to notice that this word, the vision, is significant, because from here on out, that picture that he has seen, which climaxed in the question, how long, and 2,300 days the answer, this is called the vision. And it's going to be referred to many times in the book of Daniel. We won't have a chance to pursue that, but you study that out. And notice, it says the vision, and this is what we're dealing with here. All right, it says, I had seen the vision, and sought for what? The meaning. Then, behold, there stood before me as the appearance of what? As the appearance of whom? A man. Now, it does not say a man clothed in linen, but it does say a man. And then it describes where he is, verse 16, and I heard a man's voice between the banks of what? Of Ulai, which called and said, Gabriel, make this man to understand. Now, who alone would have authority to tell Gabriel to make Daniel to understand? Christ would. All right, here, we have not had any expression of linen yet. But we have the man described above the waters, and he's also answering a question regarding how long. Now, turn back with me to chapter 12. And if I don't always get them the same, just leave a space for, between. Chapter 12 and verses 6 and 7. And there's a question raised here. It says, one said to the man clothed in what? Linen. Now we have this established very definitely now. First of all, it was called the man between the waters. The question was raised, and he gave command to Gabriel to explain the question. Now he is a man in authority. He must be the Son of God, because only Christ would be able to command Gabriel. Then when we come to chapter 10, we see this man in linen, and he's described in certain terms so that we cannot doubt it, that he is the divine Son of God. Now we find the same man clothed in linen in chapter 12, verse 6, and one said unto the man clothed in linen, which was upon the what? The waters of the river. Now, are we sure then we're talking about the same thing? In Daniel 8, the man was upon the what? He was over the waters, wasn't he? The river. And in chapter 10, he was upon the waters. Same man clothed in linen. Now we find that man clothed in linen again upon the waters. Now, there's no question about it. The God of heaven has so ordained that the symbols would lock in together so that we wouldn't have to be asking, is this a new vision or is this something else? No. It's the same basic vision we're still dealing with. And what does it say? How long shall it be? To the end of what? To the end of these wonders. Now what is the question? How long? Well, take a look at chapter 8 and we see that we're dealing with that same vision, because there it says in verse 13, then I heard one saint speaking to another saint, and another saint said unto that certain saint which spake, how long shall be the what? The vision. What vision? The vision of that little horn. He hasn't said in 2,300 days yet, but it's the little horn which we'll be talking about tomorrow night. That's our subject tomorrow night. And I would like to urge you all to be present and bring others with you. There's a lot of questions being raised about the little horn today. And did you know that's a tremendous thing, because it offers us an opportunity to discover something marvelous about what God has revealed to us. The study of the little horn will not simply be a negative meeting. It will have some tremendous positive overtones. And so it says, I heard a saint speaking, and he asked about the vision. How long shall be what? The vision concerning the daily. Now we're going to be talking about that tomorrow night. And the transgression of desolation, to give both the sanctuary and the host to be trodden underfoot. And what was the answer? And he said unto me, unto 2,300 days, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. Now we find over in chapter 12 the same question, how long? And we're dealing with the same basic concept, because it says how long will it be to the end of these what? These wonders. All right? Now, let's go back to chapter 8 for a moment again. And, to the end of these wonders, let's take just a moment on that before we move on. Chapter 12, verse 7 is the one, it says, to the end of these wonders. But if you go back to chapter 7, you find that it's not only linking chapter 8, but it reaches right back to chapter 7. Indeed, chapter 7 and chapter 8 are parallel prophecies. Chapter 8 was given for the specific purpose of explaining things about the vision of chapter 7 that were not included in chapter 7, extending it. And we find in chapter 7, verse 21, the statement, it says, I beheld on the same horn, that's the little horn that he had seen, parallels of the little horn of chapter 8, and the same horn made war with what? With the saints who prevailed against them. And verse 25 says, he shall speak great words against the Most High, and shall wear out the saints of the Most High. And chapter 12 has to do especially with the wearing out of the saints of the Most High. If you look at it again, it says, how long will it be to the end of these wonders, these awful things that we've been seeing? And the answer is given. We're going to pause a moment before going to the answer, though, because I want to go back to verses 4 and 9 of the same chapter. Before we get the answer, I want to give the setting. The setting is that God speaks to Daniel, and he says, Daniel, shut up the words. Daniel 12:4, shut up the what? The words, and seal what? The book. Even until what? The time of the end. Now in chapter 12, verse 4, gives a command. I want you, Daniel, to shut up the words and seal the book even until the time of the end. But this reminds us of something we can find over in chapter 8, verse 26. That is the same chapter that gives the little horn and that says unto 2,300 days. And then Gabriel is commissioned by the man upon the waters of Ulai. He is commissioned to explain the vision, and in his explanation, instead of getting directly to what it actually means, he first establishes what it applies to. And he says in verse 17, understand, O Son of Man, for at the time of the end shall be the vision. Before explaining it, he says, you can't even understand what I'm talking about if you don't understand a very vital point, and that is that the vision does not relate to your day, Daniel. There are some who say that the prophecy in Daniel 8 must be considered to be intended by God to be understood by the contemporaries and be fulfilled at that time. That's not true. Before Gabriel can explain what it is, he has to first explain where it applies to. Not your own time, Daniel, but way down in the end of time. And then it was so important that in verse 19 he repeats, he says, behold, I will make you to know. Now he's ready to explain it. But before he explains the thing, he repeats it twice. I want you to know, and I will make you to know, what shall be at the last end of what? Indignation. Now, what does indignation mean? Wrath. How I wish we had time to show the linkage between this and the last half of the book of Revelation, which is full of judgment prophecies of the wrath of God being poured out, his final wrath. And so it refers not only to the end of time, but shows that it links with that time when God's final wrath is poured out. For at the time appointed, what? The end shall be. And then look down to verse 26. And the vision of the evening and the morning is true. How unusual for God to refer to something he has just given as being true. It must be most urgent for us to be settled in our minds that it is true. So settled that we cannot be moved. It is true. And then it says, wherefore, shut thou up the vision. You shut up what? The vision. What was it that God commanded in particular to be shut up? The vision of the 2300 days, that little horn vision. We'll be talking about that tomorrow night. That is what was to be shut up. You shut it up, for it'll be for many days. Daniel, don't think it's a contemporary prophecy. This is a prophecy that is going to go right down to the end of time. You shut it up. This is the vision that would not be understood. Now, I want you to notice that the whole of Daniel was not shut up. It was this vision that was shut up. And in Daniel 12:4, it says, shut up the words and seal what? The vision. What vision is he talking about that has to be sealed up? It's this one. There are some things in Daniel that were open. Why, you take the great prophecy, that first, the simple one, of that structure of the man, the image. There was much in that could be understood. And in Christ's day, there were many things that could be understood. Even chapter 9 was understood enough to know, and John was able to preach, and Jesus preached, the time is fulfilled. The time of what? The time of chapter 9 in Daniel. But what was it that was sealed? Oh, the 2300-day prophecy. That is what was sealed. Now I want you to notice that when you get to chapter 10 of Revelation, we find something very interesting. Now notice we've been dealing with the same character, same personage. The man clothed with linen, called an angel, clothed with a cloud, and so forth in chapter 10. But in chapter 10, verse 2, it says that he has in his hand something very important. What is it? It's a little book, and it is now what? Open. Do you see? It was Christ himself who commissioned the closing of the book, and it is Christ himself who opens it. Isn't that interesting? Oh, brothers and sisters, there's so many things about our message. There are so many evidences. We need not be discouraged. We need not question. It is certainly good for us to study and to make sure we understand. And so the question was, how long? We've already touched on that. How long will he wear out the saints? How long will he scatter the people? The power of the people? I think we read that in chapter 12, verse 7, didn't we? Maybe we didn't read verse 7. Let's take a look at Daniel 12:7. I guess we just got to verse 6. Anyway, the question, how long, in verse 6, in chapter 7, at the close of it, it says, how long will it be when, and I'm picking up at the end, and when he shall have accomplished to what? Scatter the power of what? Of the holy people. Now, what single word can we use for holy people? Saints. That's right. Isn't that what saints means? Saints means holy people. All right, now chapter 7, verse 25 says he will wear out what? The saints of the Most High. How long does chapter 7 say he's going to be wearing them out? And they shall be given into his hand. We're talking about chapter 7, verse 25. And they shall be given into his hand into what? Time and times and what? And dividing of time. All right, what does chapter 12 say? Verse 7. You see, the question how long is posed in chapter 8. But chapter 12 shows that chapter 7 and 8 have to be brought together because it pulls them into itself. as though they're a unit. From chapter 8, it echoes the question, how long? And from chapter 7, it brings the time element, how long? It answers it under time and times and half a time. Now that is from Daniel 7:25, but here we find it in chapter 12, verse 7. But notice, also linked with it is the wearing out of the saints. Because in chapter 12, verse 7, it says, time, times, and a half a time. And when he shall have accomplished, okay, at the close of that time, time, and a half time. Do you get that? When he shall have accomplished to scatter the power of the what? Of the saints. Called saints in 7:25, could have been translated saints here. He shall wear out the saints of the Most High for how long? Time, times, and a half a time. What does it say here? Times, times, and a half. And when he shall have accomplished, or when this is finished, when the time, times, and a half time is over, finished to accomplish to scatter the power of the holy people, all these things shall be what? Finished. Oh yes. Then the focus is put upon the close of the time, time, and a half a time, that something now, at that point, is going to be finished. To be able to recognize some of the minor keys, let's go quickly to 7 again, and notice that there is a left hand and a right hand. Now it's very simple and not too significant in itself, but it's interesting to see how there are parallels. Over in chapter 10, we find in verse 2, this angel puts his left foot upon what? The earth, and his right foot upon the sea. All right? Now, it's true that we're dealing with feet here and not hands, but we're going to see something very interesting in a moment, because the angel puts his left foot upon the earth and his right foot upon the sea. What does this symbolize? With this angel representing Christ, with one foot upon the earth and one on the sea, what does that symbolize? Absolutely total world coverage, right? Worldwide. Now, in Daniel, though, it says in chapter 12, verse 7, I heard the man clothed with linen. Who are we talking about? The man clothed with linen, which was upon the what? The waters. These are all signals that have come through, linking it clear back with Ezekiel, and on over into Revelation. When he held up his right hand and his left hand unto what? Heaven, he did what? He sware. Now who did he swear by? He sware by him that liveth forever and ever. Now this may seem to be not too significant, but when you get over to chapter 10 in Revelation, you suddenly discover that we're faced the same thing again. And so let's take a look at chapter 10, verse 2. And he had in his hand a little book open. Now God said to Daniel, you close it until the time of the end. And now we suddenly see the book open. What can we know? With all these parallels, we can know that this is a picture of what happens at the close of that period, when Christ, who commanded the book to be closed, now himself opens it. And he set his right foot upon the sea and his left foot upon the earth, and then he cried with a loud voice, and verse 6 says what he said. Verse 6, and he sware, get this, he sware by him that liveth forever and ever. Where is that a quote from? That is quoted directly from Daniel 12:7. Directly. Word for word. He sware by him that liveth forever and ever, that what? That there should be time no longer. What time is no longer to be? Oh, the great prophetic time clock of God has now come to the close. However, there are other translations who put this, there shall be no more delay. Indeed, the majority, if not all, of the modern ones do. There shall be no more delay. That also has the same significance, doesn't it? Because the question was raised in Daniel, how long? Chapter 8. How long? And what is the answer? Under 2,300 days. Then the question again was, how long? And the answer, 1,260 years must first elapse, and that will be the end of time, and then the book will be opened. Do you see the point? All right, Daniel 8, verse 13. The question, how long? The answer comes in verse 14, into 2,300 days. Then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. Chapter 12, which pulls chapter 7 and 8 both into focus together, raises the same question, how long, and answers it by another time prophecy. A time, times and a half a time, the 1,260-year prophecy. And that is significant because it is designated as the time of the end. Whereas in this chapter to Daniel, where Daniel in chapter 8, verse 26, he says you seal up the word, you close and you shut up the vision. But just before that, he says this vision pertains to the time of what? The time of the end. See, the time of the end isn't just a certain punctiliar point. It is a period of time that begins with the close of the 1,260 years, and that is indicated. You see, the 1,260-year prophecy was already given in chapter 7. And in chapter 12, where we give this verse 7, several verses in there, which pulls several pieces directly from chapter 7 and others from chapter 8, the same question, how long, is answered not until after the 1,260-year period is completed. And when he will have done what? He says when he will have completed to... I think was the word completed. Let's see here. When he shall have accomplished to scatter. See, he's just said the time, times and a half time. When he shall have accomplished the scattering over that wilderness period. All right. Then it says this how long is answered in this way. It will begin then. Now, notice. It says the time of the end right here in chapter 12. But in chapter 8, when Gabriel is told to explain to Daniel, he begins by saying, Daniel, it isn't going to be right away. This relates to what? The time of the end. Twice he mentions that. And then he says, for many days you seal it up. And now, when he declares that it will be sealed until the time of the end in chapter 12, verse 4, you see? He specifically says the time of the end. That's right. We don't have time to deal with the prophetic element of the 1,260 years, but it relates from about 533 to 38 to 1793 to 1798. Now notice, it was with an oath that God proclaimed the book would be opened at the close of the 1,260 years and at the end of time. It was with an oath on the part of whom? The angel, the man clothed in linen, Christ himself. It is with an oath that same being, Christ, opens the book at the time of the end. Do you see the picture, brothers and sisters? You look in chapter 10, verse 6 of Revelation, and you find the same divine oath. Indeed, it makes certain that we understand it's the same because in the man clothed in linen swears by him that liveth forever and ever when he closes the book. And when he declares it will be closed for 1,260 years. When the book is opened, the oath is also to him that liveth what? Swear by him that liveth forever and ever. No question, brothers and sisters. God has locked these things in so that we need not be tossed to and fro by every wind of doctrine. Now, take a look at We've already had the time of the end. You can put those down there, Miriam. Take a look at chapter 11 in Revelation. Now, we have noticed that the time, times, and a half a time. And then in chapter 10, verse 6, the time no longer delay. At the close of the 1260 years, there'll be no more delay now. These prophecies will be open. And then we look again and we find in chapter 11, verses 2 and 3, a reference to the time, times, and a half a time. It's interesting, brothers and sisters. Do you know that there are two references to the time, time, and a half a time in Daniel, both of them relating to the little horn and both of them having to do with the close of a period which will open on the judgment against the little horn. In Revelation, it is given 5 times. The first 2 of those 5 times is in conjunction with this angel that stands with the book open. Oh, brothers and sisters, this can be no accident. And the interesting thing is it gives them in different symbols so as to confirm the fact that the time, times, and a half a time did indeed represent 1260 days or prophetic years. And so what we find in chapter 11, verse 2, it says there, at the close of that, they shall tread under foot 42 months. Now this is the holy city that's going to be tread underfoot. This is the little horn treading him underfoot, by the way. It doesn't call it little horn here, but that's what it is. The little horn power. 42 months. How many is 42 months? Multiply 42 months times 30 days, you have 1260 days or years. Then take a look at the next verse to make sure that we understand that God's symbols, what God's symbols are. The very next verse says, and I will give power unto my 2 witnesses, and they shall prophesy how long? 1,260 days. All right? Twice in Daniel, time, times, and a half a time. When we come to the same period in Revelation in the same context exactly, it says 42 months. And then to make sure we understand, it says 1,260 days. But it still hasn't said time, times, and a half a time. Is it possible that maybe it's not the same? Oh, brothers and sisters, no possibility. Look at chapter 12, verse 14. In verse 12, we won't have time to discuss it all, but this is a continued explanation of the same theme. Verse 14, and to the woman were given 2 great wings as of a great eagle. 2 wings as of a great eagle, that she might fly into what? The wilderness. You see, it's the wilderness period we're talking about. That she might fly into the wilderness, into her place where she is nourished for what? Time, times, half a time. Now, listen. We can lock this in now completely, because if you go back to verse 6, it says 42 months. And so in Revelation 11 and 12, we have 42 months, 1260 years, 42 months, and time, time, and a half time, every single time talking about the same period of time and the same power. Now, can there be any question but what this is an interpretation of Daniel 7, 8, and 12? I don't think so. Now, we're going to come to something very interesting now. We're going to go back to chapter 10 of Revelation. And verse 8 says, and the voice I heard from heaven, this is from that angel, spake unto me again and said, go take the little book which is open, pardon me, it's the voice from heaven regarding the angel, go take the little book which is open in what? In the hand of the angel, which standeth upon the sea and upon the earth. All right, now this angel has a little book. Now, John the Revelator is commanded to go over there and take that book. And then what is he asked to do? Verse 9 says, I went unto the angel and said unto him, give me the little book. And he said, take it and eat it up. Who gives him this command? Jesus himself. Who is it that commanded the people of the Midnight Cry movement to eat up the little book? It was Christ himself. Brothers and sisters, do you understand what an urgent question this is? For anyone to deny the reality of the midnight cry movement is to deny the very command of Jesus Christ himself. It isn't just a question of whether we want to or believe or whether we don't. It's a question of whether or not we are willing to accept the voice of Jesus Christ. What Jesus Christ himself has commanded can never be annulled. No matter how many spies there are that come back and say we can't go over and that there's something wrong and that we have followed the wrong movement, we should have stayed in Egypt. Brothers, impossible for Christ to lie. He says, I am the way, the truth. But not only that, you stick with me, I am the life. And whoever receives me receives life. And the words that I speak, they are spirit, and they are what? Life. Brothers and sisters, this is a marvelous message. And the confirmations within it are many. You eat it up. It will be in your mouth what? Sweet like honey. In your belly, it will be bitter. You see, the sweet period from 1798, when that book is opened, and sweeter all the time right up until 1844, and suddenly the sweetness turns to bitterness. A case of terrible indigestion, which we're going to talk about tomorrow night. We're going to discuss the reason. God knew it long before. He prophesied of it. And brothers and sisters, we do not need to be ashamed because of the disappointment, because God predicted it. Oh, he says it's going to be bitter. But did you know, and I think because of our time, I'm just going to give you the reference. You can go back to it. But Ezekiel 2, verses 8 to chapter 3:3, this book, open book, and the bittersweet experience is drawn from that. It doesn't mention bitter specifically, but, well, maybe I'd better read one verse to you there. Ezekiel, the second and third chapters, and the 10th verse, the last verse after verse 8 says, Open your mouth and eat that I give you. And when I looked, behold, and a hand was sent unto me, and lo, a roll of a book was therein. And he spread it before me, and it was written within and without, and there was written therein lamentations, mourning, and what? Woe. Isn't that bitter? Lamentations, mourning, and woe. That certainly is bitter. And then it says, verse 3, And he said unto me, Son of man, cause thy belly to eat, and fill thy bowels with this roll that I give you. Then did I eat it, and it was in my mouth sweet, as honey for sweetness. Where did the symbol from Revelation come from? Directly from Ezekiel. And Ezekiel is dealing with judgment. Lamentations, mourning, woe, bitterness. But in the mouth is how? Sweet, like honey. And then we look back at Revelation 10. The last verse after the bitterness, it says, you're going to have to prophesy again. Verse 11. He said to me, Thou must prophesy again before what? Many peoples and nations and tongues and kings. All right, now, he didn't say you must prophesy. He said you must prophesy again. What does that prove about the little book that was open? It proves that it was a book of prophecy. There would be no sense in saying you prophesy again if he hadn't prophesied already. Indeed, it was this prophecy that had brought the great disappointment, which we're going to discuss tomorrow night. And then he says, There was given unto me a reed like unto a rod. And the angel stood saying, I wish there was no chapter break here, by the way, because the movement of thought moves right on. And there was given to me a reed like unto a rod, and the angel stood saying, Rise and measure what? The temple of God, and the altar, and them that worship therein. Oh, measure. What does it mean to measure something? To evaluate, to examine, to judge. Oh, brothers and sisters, this is a very strong evidence that when the great disappointment took place, God wanted them to shift their eyes to the sanctuary, the temple of God in heaven, and to recognize that this point of bitterness would mark the beginnings of an investigation of the sanctuary. It would also an investigative judgment, both involving the sanctuary and the believers. Because it says, and those that worship therein. Notice, who is to be examined? Not just the sanctuary, but them that what? Worship there. And also the altar. Oh, brothers and sisters, the altar is so important. It represents the cross of Christ. We need to re-examine the cross. We must know what the cross means. If we do not restudy the nature of the cross, then we will fall under the delusions of a false cross, with a false Christ and a false message, which brings false hope and exposure to the wrath of God. And then, verse 18, and the nations were angry, and thy wrath is what? Is come. And the time of the dead, that they should be what? Judged. Hebrews, the 9th chapter, verse 27, says very plainly, is appointed men once to die, and after that the what? Judgment. All right, here it says, the time appointed for the judgment of the dead is come. That thou shouldest give them reward unto their servants, and shouldest destroy them that what? Destroy the earth. And what does it say then? The temple of God was open where? In heaven. What temple must be evaluated, measured, and judged? The temple in heaven. The sanctuary in heaven, brothers and sisters. And what does he see? Oh, does he see the candlesticks and the altar of incense? No. And there was seen the ark of his testament. What room are we looking into? The most holy place. And it says there in verse 15, and the seventh angel sounded, and there were great voices in heaven saying, the kingdoms of this world are become the kingdoms of our Lord and of his Christ, and he shall reign forever and ever. Oh, brothers and sisters, what a wonderful, wonderful picture. But where is this drawn from? Well, from Daniel, of course. From Daniel. It was Daniel that gave us the picture, chapter 7. I tell you, it's a thrilling thing to see how God interlocks his prophecies. Chapter 7 and verse 9. I beheld till thrones were cast, and the Ancient of Days did what? Sit. Whose garment was white as snow, and the hair of his head like pure wool, and his throne, which we saw in Ezekiel in connection with that man clothed in linen, you remember that? And his throne, it says, was like a fiery flame. That's what Ezekiel pictured it as. And his wheels, oh, where did the wheels come from? Why, brothers and sisters, isn't that wonderful? Those wheels are from Ezekiel's vision. When God gave Daniel his vision, do you see what God did? He gave him the same visualization, and Ezekiel and Daniel had been reading Ezekiel's prophets just the same as Ezekiel had been reading Daniel's life. And said, though Noah, Daniel, and Job were in the land, yet they couldn't save but themselves. Ezekiel read Daniel's life before he wrote his prophecies, but Daniel was reading Ezekiel's voice of God, the visions of God, and chose, in describing his visions of God, to use the very language of Ezekiel. What? Which verses? Let's see, what are we? Chapter 7, verse 9. wheels like burning fire. Now verse 10, a fiery stream issued and came forth from before him. Thousands ministered into him, and 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him, and the judgment was what? Ah, do you see, we're looking into the most holy place where the throne room is, and the judgment was set, and the books were what? Were opened. Oh, brothers and sisters, there's no confusion here. We find a message from God, a message of a sanctuary that's enduring a period of judgment, a period of time in which God's own people are being investigated as well as the sanctuary. A period of time in which the great high priest, however, is there to plead the case of everyone who chooses to believe that we can go in, of those who are willing to accept his word rather than man's denial of his word. And so we find then in verse 10, the books were open. In verses 13 and 14, I saw in the night vision, and behold, one like the Son of Man. Here's a key. One like the Son of Man came with the clouds of heaven, and came to the Ancient of Days, and they brought him near before him. And then what happened? And there was given unto him dominion and glory, and a kingdom, and all nations and languages shall serve him, and his dominion shall be an everlasting dominion, and which shall not pass away, and his kingdom shall not be destroyed. And this is what is being quoted in Revelation 11, verse 15, and onward. Well, brothers and sisters, I just want to say tonight that verse 26 of chapter 7 is a verse I want to be able to claim. But the judgment shall sit, and they shall take away his dominion. What does his refer to? The little horn, which is sponsored by Satan. Take away his dominion to consume and to destroy it unto the end. I want to claim that, brothers and sisters. God says he's going to take away Satan's dominion, and I believe it. In order for him to place that mark upon my heart and upon my mind, he must remove Satan's dominion first from my life. And the declaration is here that during the judgment, God is going to do that. He's going to take away his power. He's going to reduce that enemy to helplessness. And through his own power, through his own glory, through his own presence, he is going to reveal before the world what the character of God is really like. The visions of God. Oh, do you see? God not only gave Ezekiel visions, but he plans to give the world visions through the lives of those who receive the seal upon the forehead. Take away his... Oh, listen how final this is. Take away his vision and destroy it unto the end. And the kingdom and the dominion and the greatness of the kingdom under the whole heaven shall be given to the people of the saints of the Most High. As we close tonight, I want to leave with you this thought. The kingdom is yours. No, not the little horn kingdom. That is going to be destroyed to the end. But the kingdom that Jesus came to win back is ours. We can claim it today, if we're willing to claim victory over the little horn. And very soon Jesus will come back again. True, the brightness of his glory will slay all who have given allegiance to the little horn, who have not recognized that the prison doors are open and they can go free. May God help us tonight to go free. We are able. We can do it. Oh, no, of course we can't. The 10 spies, their words are still correct, and they'll always be right. There's no way to do it. But he can do it. But he chooses to do it only in and through those who believe it. The just shall live by faith. Shall we bow our heads? Heavenly Father, thank you so much for your many blessings. As we come to the close of this message, we want to thank you for your wonderful goodness. We thank you for Ezekiel's picture, which is used as a springboard in Daniel and Revelation to provide an intricate net of prophecies which make it certain that our feet have been planted in the pathway of life. Lord, teach us how to look to the man clothed in linen and to receive his mark. In the name of Jesus, amen. Brothers and sisters,